We're now just minutes away from President Obama's address to the nation on the eve of the 13th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. He'll outline his plans for destroying the new enemy, ISIS. As we've said in a speech exactly 1 year ago tonight, President Obama said he would not be asking Congress to approve airstrikes after Syria's use of chemical weapons. His exact words, "America is not the world's policeman." Joining me now, senior political analyst David Gergen and chief Washington correspondent Jake Tapper, also political commentator Donna Brazile, and Newt Gingrich, co-anchor of CNN's Crossfire and former House Speaker. David Gergen, let me start with you. You said on this program a week and a half ago the administration needed to articulate its position on the issue of ISIS. What does he need to say tonight?
Well, I think he needs to be very clear that his mission is to destroy ISIS. I think that's what he's going to do. I think we need to understand coming out of this how he's going to use air power. It now appears that he is going to say that we'll use air power in Syria as well as Iraq. That's very important. We need to know about American troops. You know, the phrase that's been used so far is no boots on the ground. Interestingly, tonight, the president uses a new phrase. He says it will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. That sounds to me, I may be reading too much into this, Anderson, but it sounds to me like he's leaving room for putting a fair number of troops in who can be special ops, who are not fighting, but are helping the fighters in all sorts of ways, and be a fair number of Americans there. Finally, I'd like to hear more about this comparison that he makes tonight between what he's doing now in Somalia and Yemen. Somalia and Yemen have been going on for years and years. They've been very small operations. They've been sort of special ops type operations. And frankly, they haven't achieved a whole lot. They've had some successes. No Americans have been killed, but we still have a lot of terrorism there.
Speaker Gingrich, it is interesting to hear the president comparing this to Yemen, comparing it to Somalia. I just had General Hertling on, who said this is actually more complicated from a military standpoint and a political standpoint than the war in Iraq was.
Well, I think the idea that success is going to be defined as Mogadishu and Sana'a is crazy. If we're not out to defeat the Islamic State and find a way to help, for example, the Sunni Arabs in the West in Iraq regain control of their territory, then we're engaged in this could go on for 50 years. I mean, Somalia is a disaster. Yemen is teetering on being a disaster. For the president to cite them as success stories, I think, is pretty frightening to any knowledgeable person.
Jake, it is interesting because right now, I mean, there is a lot of American support behind this in the wake of the beheading videos. But as the speaker said, I mean, this is an open-ended military campaign. There's no end in sight to this.
Well, he's going to have to explain exactly what the military strategy is beyond the airstrikes in Iraq, which have been limited to just protecting American citizens and also engaging in humanitarian aid. What is he going to do in Iraq? Is he going to expand the targets? Is he going to expand the mission there? Obviously, go into whether or not he's going to do airstrikes in Syria. And I think David's on target, too. The question about no boots on the ground, no boots on the ground. It's repeated as a mantra, almost as if the American people should take from that, no American soldier is going to die. Well, these are risky missions, and there will be boots on the ground in the sense that there will be American soldiers on the ground. Maybe they're not in traditional artillery or combat roles, but they'll be training, they'll be advising, they'll be providing intelligence, they'll be doing recon, they'll be embedded within Iraqi and other troops. And so I think the president also needs to explain to people this is not without risk.
There's already 500 U.S. advisors on the ground. No doubt there's going to be hundreds more. Right. There's going to be hundreds more needed for an ongoing open-ended military operation, Don.
Well, first of all, I think the president has to make clear to the country that he is going to treat ISIL or ISIS the same way he treated al-Qaeda. He's going after them. He will not give them a safe haven nowhere in the world. I think he's made that clear with the 150 airstrike. He's prevented a genocide on that mountain in Iraq. He's helped the Iraqi army reboot itself so that they can fight ISIL on the ground. We need more than just airstrikes. We need a political strategy also to make sure that the Iraqi government will not go back to alienating these Sunni tribes that has fueled the ISIS campaign, the ISIL campaign inside of Iraq.
And as General Hertling pointed out, you're not just dealing with what's happening inside Iraq, you're also dealing with civil war in Syria. Everybody just stand by for a moment. To our viewers just tuning in, we're coming up on the top of the hour. President Obama's address to the nation. He's expected to lay out the strategy against ISIS or ISIL in Iraq and Syria and talk about the global and regional partners who will play supporting roles. We're expecting him to speak for about 15 minutes. We're going to devote the rest of the hour to the implications. I want to turn things over right now to Wolf Blitzer.
Anderson, thanks very much. The president speaks on this, the eve of the 13th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. 13 years, two major wars, one ongoing battle against terrorists. We've seen Osama bin Laden killed, Saddam Hussein toppled, thousands of Americans die in battle. All of our lives have changed over these 13 years. People say they're tired of war. They also say they're deeply concerned about what could be the next major terror threat. And many say they're impatient with the president's strategy so far to deal with it. Against that backdrop, President Obama getting ready to speak. You're looking at live pictures from the Cross Hall over there at the White House as we await the president. Quick thought, Jake Tapper, as we get ready to hear what could be one of the most important speeches of his presidency.
I think it's going to be very important for President Obama to define the mission. What exactly does success look like? Is it just a matter of, to use the term he used, managing the problem, turning it into ISIS into a manageable problem, a regional problem? Also, he's going to need to describe what are other countries going to do. We already see the State Department sending out statements of support from countries ranging from the UK and Australia to the Maldives and the Arab League. What exactly does that mean, that support? Are other countries going to be bringing in troops? Are other countries going to be bringing in support? And lastly, there is a big homeland security component of this, because one of the reasons why polls are so high is because the American people are scared from those videos they've seen of the beheadings, and 71% of the American people are convinced, because there have been national security officials saying this, that there are ISIS cells in the United States. So what is he going to do to keep the homeland safe?
All right, the president, he's been in the red room. He's heading to the blue room. The president will then walk into this hallway. You'll see him walking in momentarily, within a few seconds. In fact, the president will come in. He's got a very, very carefully crafted address to the nation. A lot of audiences will be listening very carefully, including ISIS itself.
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to speak to you about what the United States will do with our friends and allies to degrade and ultimately destroy the terrorist group known as ISIL. As Commander-in-Chief, my highest priority is the security of the American people. Over the last several years, we have consistently taken the fight to terrorists who threaten our country. We took out Osama bin Laden and much of al-Qaeda's leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've targeted al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen and recently eliminated the top commander of its affiliate in Somalia. We've done so while bringing more than 140,000 American troops home from Iraq and drawing down our forces in Afghanistan, where our combat mission will end later this year. Thanks to our military and counterterrorism professionals, America is safer. Still, we continue to face a terrorist threat. We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as threats emerge. At this moment, the greatest threats come from the Middle East and North Africa, where radical groups exploit grievances for their own gain. And one of those groups is ISIL, which calls itself the Islamic State. Now, let's make two things clear. ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. And ISIL is certainly not a state. It was formerly al-Qaeda's affiliate in Iraq and has taken advantage of sectarian strife and Syria's civil war to gain territory on both sides of the Iraq-Syrian border. It is recognized by no government, nor by the people it subjugates. ISIL is a terrorist organization, pure and simple, and it has no vision other than the slaughter of all who stand in its way. In a region that has known so much bloodshed, these terrorists are unique in their brutality. They execute captured prisoners. They kill children. They enslave, rape, and force women into marriage. They threatened a religious minority with genocide. And in acts of barbarism, they took the lives of two American journalists, Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff. So ISIL poses a threat to the people of Iraq and Syria and the broader Middle East, including American citizens, personnel, and facilities. If left unchecked, these terrorists could pose a growing threat beyond that region, including to the United States. While we have not yet detected specific plotting against our homeland, ISIL leaders have threatened America and our allies. Our intelligence community believes that thousands of foreigners, including Europeans and some Americans, have joined them in Syria and Iraq. Trained and battle-hardened, these fighters could try to return to their home countries and carry out deadly attacks. I know many Americans are concerned about these threats. Tonight, I want you to know that the United States of America is meeting them with strength and resolve. Last month, I ordered our military to take targeted action against ISIL to stop its advances. Since then, we've conducted more than 150 successful airstrikes in Iraq. These strikes have protected American personnel and facilities, killed ISIL fighters, destroyed weapons, and given space for Iraqi and Kurdish forces to reclaim key territory. These strikes have also helped save the lives of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. But this is not our fight alone. American power can make a decisive difference, but we cannot do for Iraqis what they must do for themselves. Nor can we take the place of Arab partners in securing their region. And that's why I've insisted that additional U.S. action depended upon Iraqis forming an inclusive government, which they have now done in recent days. So tonight, with a new Iraqi government in place and following consultations with allies abroad and Congress at home, I can announce that America will lead a broad coalition to roll back this terrorist threat. Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Working with the Iraqi government, we will expand our efforts beyond protecting our own people and humanitarian missions so that we're hitting ISIL targets as Iraqi forces go on offense. Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven. Second, we will increase our support to forces fighting these terrorists on the ground. In June, I deployed several hundred American service members to Iraq to assess how we can best support Iraqi security forces. Now that those teams have completed their work and Iraq has formed a government, we will send an additional 475 service members to Iraq. As I've said before, these American forces will not have a combat mission. We will not get dragged into another ground war in Iraq. But they are needed to support Iraqi and Kurdish forces with training, intelligence, and equipment. We'll also support Iraq's efforts to stand up National Guard units to help Sunni communities secure their own freedom from ISIL's control. Across the border in Syria, we have ramped up our military assistance to the Syrian opposition. Tonight, I call on Congress again to give us additional authorities and resources to train and equip these fighters. In the fight against ISIL, we cannot rely on an Assad regime that terrorizes its own people, a regime that will never regain the legitimacy it has lost. Instead, we must strengthen the opposition as the best counterweight to extremists like ISIL, while pursuing the political solution necessary to solve Syria's crisis once and for all. Third, we will continue to draw on our substantial counterterrorism capabilities to prevent ISIL attacks. Working with our partners, we will redouble our efforts to cut off its funding, improve our intelligence, strengthen our defenses, counter its warped ideology, and stem the flow of foreign fighters into and out of the Middle East. And in 2 weeks, I will chair a meeting of the UN Security Council to further mobilize the international community around this effort. Fourth, we will continue to provide humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians who've been displaced by this terrorist organization. This includes Sunni and Shia Muslims who are at grave risk, as well as tens of thousands of Christians and other religious minorities. We cannot allow these communities to be driven from their ancient homelands. So this is our strategy. And in each of these four parts of our strategy, America will be joined by a broad coalition of partners. Already, allies are flying planes with us over Iraq, sending arms and assistance to Iraqi security forces and the Syrian opposition, sharing intelligence and providing billions of dollars in humanitarian aid. Secretary Kerry was in Iraq today, meeting with the new government and supporting their efforts to promote unity. And in the coming days, he will travel across the Middle East and Europe to enlist more partners in this fight, especially Arab nations who can help mobilize Sunni communities in Iraq and Syria to drive these terrorists from their lands. This is American leadership at its best. We stand with people who fight for their own freedom, and we rally other nations on behalf of our common security and common humanity. My administration has also secured bipartisan support for this approach here at home. I have the authority to address the threat from ISIL, but I believe we are strongest as a nation when the President and Congress work together. So I welcome congressional support for this effort in order to show the world that Americans are united in confronting this danger. Now, it will take time to eradicate a cancer like ISIL. And any time we take military action, there are risks involved, especially to the servicemen and women who carry out these missions. But I want the American people to understand how this effort will be different from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist using our air power and our support for partners' forces on the ground. This strategy of taking out terrorists who threaten us while supporting partners on the front lines is one that we have successfully pursued in Yemen and Somalia for years, and it is consistent with the approach I outlined earlier this year, to use force against anyone who threatens America's core interests, but to mobilize partners wherever possible to address broader challenges to international order. My fellow Americans, we live in a time of great change. Tomorrow marks 13 years since our country was attacked. Next week marks 6 years since our economy suffered its worst setback since the Great Depression. Yet, despite these shocks, through the pain we felt and the grueling work required to bounce back, America is better positioned today to seize the future than any other nation on earth. Our technology companies and universities are unmatched. Our manufacturing and auto industries are thriving. Energy independence is closer than it's been in decades. For all the work that remains, our businesses are in the longest uninterrupted stretch of job creation in our history, despite all the divisions and discord within our democracy. I see the grit and determination and common goodness of the American people every single day. And that makes me more confident than ever about our country's future. A broad American leadership is the one constant in an uncertain world. It is America that has the capacity and the will to mobilize the world against terrorists. It is America that has rallied the world against Russian aggression and in support of the Ukrainian people's right to determine their own destiny. It is America, our scientists, our doctors, our know-how that can help contain and cure the outbreak of Ebola. It is America that helped remove and destroy Syria's declared chemical weapons so that they can't pose a threat to the Syrian people or the world again. And it is America that is helping Muslim communities around the world, not just in the fight against terrorism, but in the fight for opportunity and tolerance and a more hopeful future. America, our endless blessings bestow an enduring burden. But as Americans, we welcome our responsibility to lead. From Europe to Asia, from the far reaches of Africa to war-torn capitals of the Middle East, we stand for freedom, for justice, for dignity. These are values that have guided our nation since its founding. Tonight, I ask for your support in carrying that leadership forward. I do so as a commander-in-chief who could not be prouder of our men and women in uniform. pilots who bravely fly in the face of danger above the Middle East, and service members who support our partners on the ground. When we helped prevent the massacre of civilians trapped on a distant mountain, here's what one of them said: "We owe our American friends our lives. Our children will always remember that there was someone who felt our struggle and made a long journey to protect innocent people." That is the difference we make in the world. And our own safety, our own security, depends upon our willingness to do what it takes to defend this nation and uphold the values that we stand for. Timeless ideals that will endure long after those who offer only hate and destruction have been vanquished from the earth. May God bless our troops, and may God bless the United States of America.
Speaking for less than 15 minutes, the President of the United States, with very strong words, going against ISIS, this new terror threat. The President saying the greatest threats to the United States right now come from the Middle East and North Africa, where he says radical groups exploit grievances for their own gain. He specifically cites ISIS, and then he goes on to say, "I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL," as he calls it, in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. And then he issues this warning: if you threaten America, you will find no safe haven. Bottom line, the president getting ready to potentially launch airstrikes against ISIS targets, not only in Iraq, but in Syria as well. Anderson?
Wolf, thanks very much. We're going to see Wolf again at the top of the hour to continue our live coverage of the president's address. We'll be back at 10 o'clock Eastern time. I want to bring in senior political analyst David Gergen right now. The leads, Jake Tapper, Democratic strategist Donna Brazile, and Crossfire co-host, former House Speaker and GOP presidential candidate Newt Gingrich. David Gergen, you had big expectations for this speech. Your assessment?
I thought the first part of the speech, as he talked about the attack on ISIS, was strong, presidential, serious. He did what he needed to do. He laid out the sense of a strategy. You could quibble with it. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of disagreements about some aspects of it. But I thought overall, as a presidential speech, it did very well. What surprised me, Anderson, was the second part of the speech when he started talking about how well the country is doing, how well we're doing with jobs, how we're leading around the world. I think for an awful lot of people America's feeling pretty blue right now, and I think those kind of assertions don't ring true to a lot of people, and it seemed to me that it detracted from the main message of the speech. Just as I thought he was on very, very strong ground, and when he shifted ground like that, I thought it called into question, well, how much should we believe the rest of the speech? Overall, the first part of the speech, I'd give him very high marks.
Speaker Gingrich, you had talked about tonight's speech as an opportunity to really rally the American people behind this. What do you think?
I thought it was a very strong speech overall. I agree with David. I think that if they dropped that one paragraph, it would have been stronger. And I think his description of Somalia and Yemen is very foolish. But the rest of the speech was very strong. It's probably the most explicitly pro-American speech he's ever made. He kept coming back again and again towards the end in a way that most Americans will resonate with. And I think he achieved a fair amount of what he needed to do to start this process. So I would say it's a pretty strong speech. I agree totally with his call to Congress. Congress should vote on this. This should be the American decision, not the Obama decision. Why
is that so important to you? Why do you believe that's so important?
Because this is going to take a long time. And if it's only him, then it'll be eroded very rapidly because it's easy for Republicans to figure out how to attack him. If all of us understand this is a threat to America, and we had better find, after the Bush years and the Obama years, we had 13 years of trying, we had better find an American strategy that we collectively stick to. We're going to be a much stronger country, and we're going to be able to endure the next 5 or 10 years of struggle, I think, much better.
Jake, before the speech, you talked about the importance for the president to define what the strategy is. Do you think he did that?
Well, yes. In a word, he basically, it was 4 points. One is expanding the air campaign beyond just humanitarian missions and protecting Americans in Iraq, and possibly going after ISIS in Syria. That's the first time he said that. 2, he talked about the increased role of U.S. military, training, embedding, reconnaissance, intelligence.
475 more U.S. military personnel.
More. You'll notice he didn't give the overall total, but 475 more. And then 3, of course, adding to the counterterrorism capabilities, protecting the homeland, going after financing, funding, going after foreign fighters going into Syria and Iraq, and then lastly, the humanitarian mission. Again, he talked about leading a broad coalition. He didn't go into detail about that. There are some fact sheets coming out from the State Department, from the National Security Council, that give some details on it, such as just I only had time to look at the first one, which is Albania will be sending weapons to Kurdish fighters. I have a feeling that it does have a coalition of the willing kind of feel to it. Some countries will be contributing a lot more than others, but he is trying to make the case, even though this is rather hastily done, we need to point out.
It's also interesting, Donna, he repeatedly stressed that this is a counterterrorism approach, trying to make a distinction between the wars in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. Because
he recognizes that the country is weary of war. 13 years, millions and trillions of dollars spent. The president really, I think, challenged us to come together as a country to fight this threat, to understand the nature of the threat. I thought the objectives that he laid out tonight were very clear, very concise, but I also thought his call to Congress, for Congress to get involved, to lend the resources to make sure that this is just not the president's so-called war on ISIL, but the country itself. I thought it was a good speech, a good beginning. Hopefully Congress will pick up the phone and say, Mr. President, I'm with you. Let's get this ball rolling.
Aren't there some, though, in Congress who don't really want to vote on this ahead of midterm elections? They don't want to go on record?
Yeah,
most of them. Most of them, right?
No, I think you'll find that because the country has rallied, I mean, politicians often follow the country. And the country has decisively in the last 2 or 3 weeks reached the conclusion that people who cut off the heads of American journalists are really bad. And the more they learn about them, for example, selling women into slavery, slaughtering innocent people, attacking Christians, Shia, Sunni, Muslim, I think there's a growing consensus. It's a pretty big margin. It's almost 6-1 in one poll today that says, yeah, you got to do something about this. So members are going to vote in the short run, probably in the continuing resolution is my guess, to do something to support the president, to be strong. I think he faces 2 big challenges. One is finding a lot better outcome than Yemen and Somalia. I mean, this idea that the most we can do is bomb around the region and then leave behind the wreckage of Mogadishu as a long-term goal, doesn't solve anything because you still have the wreckage. In both those countries, you have lots of terrorists running around, so it's not a solution. The second challenge will come in 2 weeks. The president's going to chair the Security Council in the United Nations. Are the Chinese going to go along with this? Are the Russians in the middle of all of our tension? The president did go out of his way to mention the challenges of Russia. He now has Russia with a veto sitting in the Security Council. I think that meeting in 2 weeks is a big deal.
If I could just ask the Speaker, don't you expect that what Congress will do will be, instead of the broad authorizing use of military force that President Bush got after 9/11 or the vote to go to war in Iraq, it'll be something small, such as there's this discussion of Title 10 amending, allowing basically the military to train the fighters as opposed to clandestine services, the CIA. Something small and maybe like a resolution stating broad support, nothing specific.
Well, my guess is they'll drop language in the continuing resolution that says the Congress supports the president in degrading and destroying the Islamic State.
It's something very easy to vote for.
Without defining specifically what that involves.
Okay.
And frankly, we'd be pretty foolish to say, yeah, you can do this over here, but you can't do that over there, because we don't know how this campaign's going to unfold.
David Gergen, the Middle East, though, has a long track record of defying the best laid plans. I mean, the way things look right now, 3 months from now, could look entirely different.
That's exactly right. I think that's one reason why Newt Gingrich was absolutely right in saying it's important that the Congress vote on this so this becomes an American project, not an Obama project. And if we're asking young men and women to put their lives on the line yet again for America, surely the Congress can put its votes on the line and go home and face the voters. We're not asking very much of them. But I think to go to your larger point, Anderson, about the uncertainties ahead, this speech was a very strong speech. What the president's going to have to do, though, is follow up with demonstrations that it actually is going to work. And to an extraordinary degree, this whole strategy depends upon the effectiveness of our partners. We're not putting troops here. When we went and had the awakening, and people say, well, we're going to have another awakening. That's what the administration has been saying. When we had the awakening, we had a ton of American troops to make sure it happened.
Right.
And here we're depending on an Iraqi army and an Iraqi government, which has not come together in the way it was described tonight. They still don't have a defense minister. They don't have an interior minister. They got a long ways to go. These are unreliable partners. We have to make them reliable, but it's a tough go.
You had, during the Sunni Awakening, you had military personnel in endless tea sessions and meetings with Sunni tribal elders handing over bags of money on the ground. I mean, it's a very different situation that without U.S. personnel in Iraq.
Absolutely.
And again, to General Hertling's earlier point, this is something which this is not just happening in one country. This is transnational. This is Syria in the midst of a civil war.
That's why the president was adamant that the Iraqi government become more inclusive, that the Sunnis are brought back into the government.
But when the president says
leadership.
They've already formed a new government, I mean, that's not really accurate. I mean, there's key posts, some of the most controversial posts in Iraq have been left unfilled. I mean, they may have new leadership, but
Maliki
there's a
is
long
gone,
road
and
on
that was a very important step for him to get away from the table.
I think most politicians flinch at being really direct with the American people, as though they're afraid that the American people can't stand the truth. Probably Churchill's most effective speech promised blood, sweat, toil, and tears because they were in desperate trouble. The president this is a good speech. I mean, I don't think you can nitpick it. It's a good speech. But the president would be better served to say to the country, we are going down a road we don't know about. We are taking on an enemy who is evil. They're going to mutate and do everything they can to survive and defeat us. We are going to run genuine risk. And he did say, there are real risks. I was actually surprised and proud of him. He said there are real risks, and young Americans are going to risk their lives to achieve this. I think we ought to drop this boots in the ground baloney. Those Americans that are needed in order to defeat ISIL, as the president calls it, or the Islamic State, as I'd call it, those Americans that are needed will end up going there, and we will run the risk necessary to defeat them.
And Anderson, you make an excellent point when you talk about the best laid plans, because obviously, without getting into a debate about the last war in Iraq, the reason that ISIS exists is because of a lot of what happened in that war not going well, and then also the withdrawal of U.S. forces. So I think what would be great is if there is a full-throated debate about this in Congress, not just among Democrats who support going to war against ISIS and Republicans who support going to war against ISIS, but Democrats and Republicans who oppose military action, the kind of thing we didn't really see in the way it needed to be done back in 2003. Again, I'm not comparing these. They're very different situations, and obviously it would be wonderful if ISIS disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow.
To your point also.
But Jake, I want to build a step further. We really need a national dialogue about how we ended up 13 years, as you pointed out, trillions of dollars, thousands of dead young Americans, many thousand more wounded young Americans.
And
the strategies didn't work. I mean, not the Bush strategy, not the Obama strategy. And we need to have an honest discussion of how difficult are these enemies and how difficult is genuine victory going to be to achieve. And this conversation will run through the 16th campaign.
And it's not only military that we need to deploy, because it's going to take more than
political. David?
Anderson, let me come back to one other point about where we go from here and the partnerships that we're trying to form. Another challenge that's going to be just around the corner is whether we can, in fact, get the big hitters in the Middle East to come with us as strong partners in this. It's a lot easier to get Albania to send something small. It's very easy to get the UK to send in something. But is Saudi Arabia going to be with us on this? Is Turkey going to be with us? What about the UAE? The ambassador, highly respected ambassador from the UAE to the United States, had a op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal today representing his country's views that if we're going to take on ISIS, we really ought to take on in a more serious way other terrorist groups that are going to cross North Africa and are threatening us as well. The president started tonight by saying North Africa and ISIS, and then he focused on ISIS. What some of our partners are asking, the King of Saudi Arabia has not been happy with this president. They've had a rocky relationship for the last couple of years. The Turks have had a rocky relationship. We've got some real work to do to make sure these are reliable, strong partners for us, and much is going to rest, not on whether this is a U.S.-European coalition, but whether it also has a very, very strong Arab contingent right there with us.
Hey, David, I want to bring in CNN's newest political commentator, President Obama's former press secretary, Jay Carney. Very happy that Jay is joining us. Thanks for being here. Also, Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, former U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, and author of Foreign Policy Begins at Home. Jay, obviously, welcome to CNN. When you left your job as press secretary, could you have envisioned the president having to address the nation on primetime television about ISIS, particularly for this president who campaigned on ending the war in Iraq, getting out of Afghanistan, to now be in the position of essentially launching an open-ended military campaign?
Well, I think the point you're making is absolutely accurate, that it is ironic, of course, given how this president was elected, the policies that he laid out, that he is having to do this. But to answer your specific question, yes, I could envision it, because I left in late June, and the threat posed by ISIS was already apparent. They had already moved dramatically across and into Iraq and taken so much territory, and the counterattack had not yet begun. I think that any president has to play the hand he's dealt, and the president, in this case, President Obama, even back when he was a candidate for office for Senate, made clear that he opposed going into Iraq, but he didn't oppose war itself, or all war. And I think he's made clear that as president, he's more than willing and able to make the tough calls to go after the most threatening terrorists in the world, wherever they are. I mean, that certainly is demonstrated by his record against core al-Qaeda, against elements in Yemen and Somalia, notwithstanding what Speaker Gingrich said accurately about the state of those countries. And I think he made clear tonight, in more forceful terms than I even expected, that we will be taking strikes in Syria, which I think is an important threshold.
I want to ask Richard Haass about that comparison to Somalia and Yemen. But first, I just want to play a little bit of sound about some of what the president said, for those who missed it. Let's listen.
I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven.
Richard Haass, I mean, the president, again, repeatedly saying this is a counterterrorism operation. This is not the war in Iraq. This is not the war in Afghanistan. But those operations in Somalia are relatively limited. Al-Shabaab is not ISIS. Yemen, the same situation. This is a U.S. bombing campaign using other actors on the ground to actually fight. Is that going to work?
In and of itself, the short answer is no. ISIS is a lot more than simply a terrorist organization. It was interesting today, Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson described ISIS as, yes, a terrorist organization, but also an insurgent army. And we have to deal with it in both of its dimensions. So what the United States needs is a bigger strategy, if you will. The good news is the president talked about expanding the purposes of U.S. policy besides protecting U.S. personnel, besides humanitarian, and he opened up the Syrian area, so Syria will no longer be a sanctuary. But what was clearly missing from the speech was any sort of a ground partner in Syria. We're talking about perhaps building up the Syrian opposition. That is a long, long, long proposition, and a risky one at that. It's divided, it's weak. So the real question is, what are we going to use to challenge ISIS on the ground? What are we going to use to take and hold territory? U.S. air power can't do that. And that, to me, is the Achilles heel of the strategy, and that was the missing component of the speech.
Well, Jay, about that, I mean, also, what happens if Assad actually does get overthrown in Syria? Is there, a bloodbath then? Are the Alawites massacred? Who takes over? Who fills the vacuum? You've seen this from the inside. How confident are you that it's possible to find so-called moderate Syrian opposition forces on the ground who actually can take on ISIS and can take on the Assad regime?
Well, I think it's more possible now than it was. Remember, when the revolt against Assad began, this was an organic protest that evolved into a war and a fight against the Assad regime, and there wasn't an existing army or force, rebel force, and it had to be developed. And I think we, as the United States, through the last several years of being very careful about engaging with rebel groups and knowing exactly who they were and what their goals and beliefs are, and then providing assistance to them, are in a better position now to assist them than we were in the past. But what Richard said is absolutely accurate.
But Jay, is that actually true? I mean, early on, you had a lot more, at least vocally moderate groups out there fighting in Syria. And it's really in the last several months they've faced tremendous losses on the battlefield, not just to the Assad regime, but also against ISIS and al-Nusra Front. You really believe it's easier now to identify moderate Syrian forces?
I think that knowing who they are is really important. We have a history that is mixed at best in assisting groups on the ground against an enemy and finding out that the groups that we've assisted then turn the arms we've provided against us and against our Western allies. And I think that process had to be very careful. It's certainly imperfect, and I think that what Richard said is very true, that is the central weakness of any strategy, because the absence of a ground force that can be successful in Syria to counter ISIS and counter Assad is a huge problem. But the question is, what's the answer? It's not U.S. forces, surely, the only answer has to be trying to build up some of the strengths of the moderate opposition.
Richard, what if Assad does actually leave power in Syria? What then?
Well, Anderson, there's lots of things, if you will, to predict. That's unfortunately unlikely to happen anytime soon. I think what's more likely to happen is Mr. Assad will be the effective mayor of the Alawite areas of the country in the west and the northwest. The real question is what happens in parts of Syria close to Iraq, the big desert areas, many of which are controlled now by ISIS or other radical Islamic groups like the Nusra organization. I do think there are some alternatives, though, to simply hoping that we can build up a quote-unquote moderate secular opposition, which, again, I don't think is a viable option anytime soon. Some of what we're trying in Iraq, we may want to try in Syria. For example, working with Sunni tribesmen and working with the Kurds. Those are two forces we can deal with. Secondly, we can try to get some of the Arab countries to consider not simply introducing air power, but possibly their special forces alongside our special forces. And I think that is something that we want to look at. And then I think we've also just got to come up with a sense of strategy inside Syria. And this gets at some very awkward questions, which is, does the United States try to take on Mr. Assad and ISIS simultaneously? Or do we essentially make it more sequential or prioritize and say, for the near term, the far more urgent threat to U.S. interests in the region and the world is ISIS? That ought to be what we concentrate on. We don't concentrate on Mr. Assad in the short run. Rather, we make him more of a medium run or long-term problem.
Arizona Republican Senator John McCain is joining us now. Senator McCain, you and I spoke just last week. You said President Obama had no goal, no strategy when it came to destroying ISIS. Mm-hmm. What did you think of what you heard tonight?
Well, I think it was a very weak argument. By the way, I'm astounded that Mr. Carney should say that the Free Syrian Army is now stronger. In fact, they've been badly,
well, that's not what I said,
damaged.
Senator. I said, if I could, sir, what I said is that we know a great deal more about the makeup of the opposition.
Come on, Jay, we knew all about them then. You just didn't choose to know. I was there in Syria. We knew them. Come on, you guys are the ones. It's your boss is the one that when the entire national security team wanted to arm and train them, that he turned them down, Mr. Carney, after.
Well, Senator, I'm not. So I think we have to agree to disagree on this.
No, facts are stubborn things, Mr. Carney, and that is his entire national security team, including his Secretary of State, said we want to arm and train and equip these people, and he made the unilateral decision to turn them down. And the fact that they didn't leave a residual force in Iraq, overruling all of his military advisors, is the reason why we're facing ISIS today. So the facts are stubborn things in history, and people ought to know them. And now the president is saying basically that we are going to take certain actions which I would favor, but to say that America is safer and that the situation is very much like Yemen and Somalia shows me that the president really doesn't have a grasp for how serious the threat of ISIS is.
Well, again, Senator, we're going to have to agree to disagree, and I think that, on the question of the residual force, there was another player in that, which was the Iraqi government, A. B. It was the fulfillment of the previous administration's withdrawal plan, C. And it was also fulfillment of the president's promise to withdraw from Iraq and not maintain a true presence in perpetuity, which I think was pretty consistent with what the American people wanted and believed was the right approach.
And
you know, we
Mr.
can't...
Carney, you are again saying facts that are patently false. The fact is, because Lindsey Graham and I and Joe Lieberman were in Baghdad, they wanted a residual force. The president has never made a statement during that or after that he wanted a residual force left behind. The Iraqis were ready to go. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that the number cascaded down to 3,500. That was not sufficient to do anything but to defend themselves. And you, in your role as a spokesperson, bragged about the fact that the last American combat troop had left Iraq. If we had left a residual force, the situation would not be what it is today, and there would be a lot more.
Senator, I can posit with great respect for you that we disagree on that, and that you.
No, you
and
can't,
that you,
because you
sir,
don't
if
have
I
the
may.
facts. You don't have the facts, Mr. Carney. That's the problem.
Senator, I understand that you present the facts that you believe are true based on the argument that you've made for a long time, sir, that we should leave troops in Iraq in perpetuity. And that's just not what this president believes. And that's, obviously he was elected president to fulfill what he believed was right for our country and right for our national security.
That didn't mean it was the right decision. That means it was a bad decision.
I certainly understand that you
disagree. Where we are today. Well, it's not a matter of disagreement, it's a matter of facts. And you have yours wrong, and you have distorted them.
Jay, does the president believe at all, if a residual force had been left on the ground in Iraq, that we would not be in this situation now?
Anderson, I think it is basically a whitewash of history to suggest that there weren't periods of enormous chaos and fighting and bloodshed in Iraq when there were tens of thousands of American troops on the ground. That is a fact. And that was true in 2004. It was true in 2007. And it was true even when we had the highest number of U.S. troops on the ground. We cannot, the United States of America, ask our military to be a permanent occupying force in a country like Iraq. We have to get to a situation where we can help build up and assist an Iraqi security force, where we can put pressure on Iraqi political leaders to form an inclusive government, which they have taken steps to do, as was noted earlier. And then we can provide the kind of military support that we're providing and action that we're taking against a threat like ISIS as appropriate. But the alternative of leaving a permanent, massive U.S. force on the ground in Iraq, not for 10 years, not for 20 years, but in perpetuity, is simply not sustainable financially, and it's not consistent with what the American people think we should do.
Senator
McCain. Again, Mr. Carney misstates the facts. We had it won thanks to the surge. It was won. The victory was there. All we needed was a force behind to provide support, not to engage in combat, but to supply support, logistics, intelligence. And by the way, the Korean War, we left troops behind. Bosnia, we left troops behind, not to fight, but be for a stabilizing force. And Mr. Carney neglects the fact that thanks to David Petraeus and Ryan Crocker, who, by the way, are very strong on this issue, that we won the conflict. And then by pulling the rug out and setting a date for withdrawal and bragging about it.
Excuse me, sir, but I think you've forgotten that the date for withdrawal was...
I think you've forgotten. No, the date for withdrawal, they always contemplated an additional date behind it, and you can ask Condoleezza Rice or George W. Bush. So
absolutely,
that's absolutely false, too. And we didn't need to go through the Iraqi parliament. All you had to do was have an agreement because we were there on the ground.
Senator McCain, let me ask you about, in terms of what you heard tonight, do you believe the U.S. can fight an effective counterterrorism strategy, which is what the president is calling this fight against ISIS, without U.S. military personnel on the ground in harm's way?
This is another falsehood the president is purveying. We already have boots on the ground, well over 1,000. We need more. But we don't need them like the 82nd Airborne sent in into direct combat. We need to have additional support there, and we need to help the Iraqi army rebuild its capabilities. But we don't have to have a ground combat invasion of the type we had before. But the fact that they didn't leave, that we weren't there before, is a direct result we are paying a very heavy price for. And it doesn't mean in perpetuity, but it does mean to keep the situation stable, which we could have done.
Senator McCain, the president also said that we have not yet detected specific plotting against our homeland. Americans who hear those words might wonder if that is really the case, then why do we need to take action against ISIS? To that, you say what?
I say that today we had a hearing and there was testimony from the counterterrorism people in the Department of Homeland Security. There is Twitter traffic right now and Facebook traffic where they are urging attacks on the United States of America. And there is a great concern that our southern border and our northern border is porous and that they will be coming across. So is there a specific direct threat? No. But is there any doubt as to what their goal is? Mr. Baghdadi, the day he left our prison in Iraq, Camp Bucca, said, "See you in New York."
And in terms of, I mean, as you said, you have been in Syria. You met with Syrian moderate opposition a while back. Do you believe there are enough on the ground right now in Iraq who actually have military capabilities that can actually stand up and fight against ISIS, against the Assad regime?
I do, but it's going to be very tough, and it's going to be a heck of a lot tougher, despite what Mr. Carney said, than it would have been 2 years ago when it was recommended by his entire national security team.
Senator McCain, I appreciate you being on tonight. Thank you very much. We got a lot ahead moments ago. President Obama laid out his strategy for degrading and destroying ISIS, describing what kind of military action it will involve and what it won't include. Let's listen.
Well, ISIL poses a threat to the people of Iraq and Syria and the broader Middle East, including American citizens, personnel, and facilities. If left unchecked, these terrorists could pose a growing threat beyond that region, including to the United States.
Welcome back. I'm here with Richard Haas, is with us. I'm here also with Jake Tapper, Newt Gingrich, Donna Brazil. Richard Haas, you heard John McCain. What did you hear? What did you think about what he had to say?
It's always hard to rerun history, but if you're asking me, would it have been wise to keep an American residual force in Iraq? I think the answer is yes. It could have done two things. It could have trained up and improved the quality of the Iraqi armed forces. And secondly, I think its mere presence there would have reduced some of the infighting. Would it have been a solution? No. As long as someone like Mr. Maliki was in power, you would have had all sorts of sectarian friction. But all things being equal, would an American presence of 5,000 or 10,000 troops for a number of years have made a contribution? I believe yes. It's, by the way, the same argument I would use for not having all U.S. troops leave Afghanistan by the end of 2016, as is now currently articulated.
Jay Carney, in terms of working with allies, how real are these coalitions?
Well, I think they're evolving, and I think what is so important about what the president laid out tonight is the added actions that have to be taken to make long-term progress against ISIL and ISIS, because it's not going to be successful just because we can organize military strikes against select targets in Iraq or Syria. It has to involve the direct participation of some of our key Sunni allies. And without that, I think the strategy would be doomed. So I think when you see Secretary Kerry working the region very hard to that end, I think that is something that will get less attention because of the drama of upping our military force. But in some ways, it's even more important than the use of force.
Richard Haas, one of the things we did not hear tonight was talk of an actual timetable, a timetable for the increase of U.S. military advisors, of potentially bombing inside Syria. This seems to be that it seems like there really is no specific timetable right now.
Well, there may be something of a timetable. It doesn't mean the president necessarily announces it. If you are going to use military force, the last thing you want to do is preview it in any specifics. You don't want to give a sense of the scale or the exact timing. An important thing of what we need to accomplish in Syria and in Iraq as well is to check the momentum of ISIS. We want to send the message that its future success is not inevitable. That, in turn, will slow the flow of recruits, I believe, and I think it'll stiffen the backbone of some of the forces that are now at times intimidated and scared of standing up to them. So I actually think it's important that the United States act, and it act quite decisively. This is not a moment for incrementalism. So I wouldn't assume that simply because the president didn't go into detail about it, that there aren't plans for the United States to act militarily and decisively.
Jake Tapper, I mean, there is an argument to be made that they need time to to gather more intelligence on the ground in Syria. Without a intensive U.S. presence there, I mean, our ability to pick out targets that are actually effective against ISIS, that's a big question.
Well, and a lot of the U.S. troops that are there now and are going to go to Iraq and possibly Syria are ones that will be doing that, picking out targets, doing reconnaissance, conducting in various intelligence operations. I think, if I could just comment for a second on the McCain-Carney showdown that we just saw, which was interesting and illuminating for a lot of reasons, especially if you know Jay and Senator McCain, as I do, and they've known each other for a long time. But one of the things that's going on here is that it has been a point of a great deal of frustration, not just for Senator John McCain, but also for Democrats, individuals who wanted President Obama to act more decisively in Syria and have been advocating that way for years. In addition, the people of Syria, a lot of the people who have been active in the Free Syrian Army and others, and I know you know this, Anderson, you've covered this a great deal over the last years, have been very frustrated. And they do see the rise of ISIS as a direct result of the Americans not filling the void. In addition, one of the reasons why you hear so many Republicans harping on the president's use of the term JV to describe ISIS back in January in that interview with The New Yorker, well, A, because Republicans love to attack President Obama, but beyond that, it's because calling ISIS JV suggests that President Obama did not think at the time that they really were to be taken seriously. And here we are, President Obama, it's September, giving a major address in prime time talking about going to war with this organization. So there's a lot of I told you so's, not just with Senator McCain and Jay Carney this evening, but in statements from congressional leaders, Republican leaders, this evening that are coming out being emailed saying it's, oh, well, thank God President Obama finally sees the world as the way it is, from Speaker Boehner.
Jay Carney, what about that JV comment? I talked to David Remnick of The New Yorker, who actually did the interview with President Obama, who said despite what the White House has been saying over the last couple of days and what the president himself is saying, that he wasn't specifically talking about ISIS, certainly David Remnick says he has little doubt the president was talking about ISIS, because David Remnick followed up by saying, well, that JV team just took over Fallujah, which is what ISIS had just done. Was that a lack of intelligence, a lack of understanding of the threat, or were they a JV team back then?
Well, I think, look, you can always go back and, as president or as a president's spokesperson, and wish you had phrased your thoughts differently, because certain expressions can come back to haunt you. I think the point that he was making is that it was not our view, the United States' view at the time, or the administration's, or the view of the intelligence community, that this specific threat or threats like it were at the same level in terms of the direct potential for an attack against the United States or our interests. And that was the comparison or the distinction that he was making with al-Qaeda, for example. But there's no question that I think the United States and a lot of the world was stunned by the rapidity with which ISIS was able to move into Iraq and take territory, and the subsequent brutality that they've demonstrated in dealing not just with Westerners and Americans, but with populations there. Those facts have forced a reassessment of the kinds of actions that we need to take and the seriousness of the threat. If I could, on the so-called McCain-Carney show, I think it is important to remember that, as I was trying to point out, that President Obama actively tried, the administration actively tried to negotiate a deal with the then Maliki government in Iraq to maintain a residual force of American troops in Iraq for the missions that Senator McCain was just talking about. The Iraqi government refused.
You're saying point blank President Obama did want to keep a residual force there?
Yes, well, I spoke about it from the podium, and he was absolutely open to that, and that was our policy, but it required the appropriate status of forces agreement to allow for the protection of our troops that we have to have. Otherwise, it would have been the height of irresponsibility to maintain troops in that situation. Look, Maliki at the time wanted American troops gone, notwithstanding what Senator McCain said, and a lot of Iraqi politicians did.
Speaker,
and I think it's also...
Jay,
sure.
Let me just break in and say two things. First, just as a logical point, you've just now said the president, by your own terms, apparently really wanted to have American troops there in perpetuity, although a few minutes ago you pointed out we didn't want troops there in perpetuity. Now, you can't have it both ways.
Well,
Second, this speech, it really struck me as we were sitting here talking. You know, reality is a harsh teacher. This speech is closer to a George W. Bush speech than it is to anything Barack Obama would have said between 2007 and this week. I mean, go through this speech and tell me, what do you think Dick Cheney would not be willing to say that's in this speech? It is a remarkable moment of a president who didn't want to be doing this, being trapped in a world. And I like the speech. I think it's a very powerful speech, but it sure is not the Obama policy prior to tonight.
But the Iraqi government did not want us to stay there with the kind of guarantees that they wanted from us. We did not want to
a
buy
status
those
of force
conditions.
agreement for viewers who do not know this is something that actually protects U.S. troops on the ground.
But they had unreasonable conditions on
Senator
American
McCain certainly
troops.
disagrees with that. He believes an agreement could have been reached.
We wanted to go to Parliament, to Parliament or not.
Well, and if
Jay, yeah, go ahead.
If I could, in responding to Speaker Gingrich, I think the distinction you might have heard, and most Americans might agree with me on this, is that the speech Dick Cheney might have given would have included dispatch of tens of thousands of troops for an invasion of a country, which was the approach they took in Iraq, which obviously the president disagreed with, and which he went out of his way tonight to make sure the American people understood that that was not what he was proposing in the strategy to deal with ISIS.
But, there is something, Anderson, that was resonant of George W. Bush, and that is the line, if you threaten America, you will find no safe haven. I mean, it sort of reminded me, either you're with us or you're not. Remember that? And remember George W. Bush saying that. So I do think that there were some reluctant echoes here.
Although that's certainly a line, I think, Jay, you probably know this better than I do, but that certainly seems to be a line that the president has said in the past. Or
well, certainly formulations of it, and he's not only said it, he's demonstrated it in ways that have made some people on the left uncomfortable. He's been relentlessly aggressive in pursuing terrorists that our government perceives as threats to the United States or our interests abroad, and that's been a sustained campaign since the day he took office. So I think the language, and I don't disagree with the Speaker's comment and others, that the language was very strong, very direct, and I think that in contrast to some of the speeches that George W. Bush had to make in the wake of 9/11, where the attack was clear on us, on our soil, one of the reasons, one of the purposes of tonight's speech is that after 13 years of military conflict, the president was having to explain why we were taking this action against a threat that was not at this time, or is not at this time, literally at our doorstep.
Donna, do you hear from some Democrats or liberals concern about the president moving this fast, moving forward an open-ended campaign in Iraq, potentially in Syria?
I think one of the greatest concerns that you heard from Democrats back in 2003, 2004, and you will probably hear again, is don't commit us without an exit strategy. Don't commit us without a clear strategy.
But there can be no exits. I mean, the nature of this conflict
I totally agree with that, but that's why I think the president laid out a very clear strategy, using the boots on the ground, which I like to say, the people who know the region, the people from the region. I think some Democrats will continue to be uncomfortable with the president's decision to even use airstrikes in Syria, but I think it's a debate that we should have following the Iraq war. We should have this conversation, and Congress should be able to have a vote on it.
But to Jake's point earlier, how do you know, when there's victory, so to speak? You can't define victory because you're not defining what it is you're doing.
There's also the argument that if it's not
over cities and towns in Iraq and Syria, that's
there's the argument you destroy ISIS, and then there's another group, an ISIS-like group of Islamists, of Salafis, who, whether it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or some name we don't yet know.
So there's no end, is what you're saying.
Well, do you believe there's an end?
Look, I think the end is going to be much harder than we think it is. Boko Haram is another example.
Right.
Yeah. But I think we need a national conversation that starts with the notion that radical Islamism is much closer to Ebola as a virus than it is a national state problem. This is different than any opponent we've ever faced. It is worldwide. Over 50 countries have sent a total of over 10,000 people to Syria, including almost 200 from the United States.
And also, we should point out also one of the things that President Obama, and it's just a small clause, although I imagine it will be a much bigger strategy, is he talks about, in his speech, he talked about countering ISIS's warped ideology. Right. And that's a specific discussion of of trying to make sure that all of these, and it's uncomfortable to talk about, but thousands of young Muslim men who are flocking to Syria and Iraq because they think what they call themselves the Islamic State are the strongest horse, as in Osama bin Laden's language, that they are no longer attracted to do that.
Well, it's also that what that is intimating is it's a war of ideas as much as it is a war of military, and that war of ideas is in many ways much harder to counter.
You can't kill an idea.
But
you have
why
madrasas which are being
support.
supported by our allies, Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan and throughout the world, which are preaching this.
But that's why it's not just a national conversation, as you point to the speaker. It's got to be an international conversation, because we've had that conversation in the United States. We continue to have it. But we need to have it with the coalition.
And that's why the Arab League is important. That's why having the Saudis involved. That's why having the Turks involved.
A statement from the Arab League. A statement from the Arab League is easy. Stopping the funding of the madrasas by Saudi Arabia. That's hard.
Right.
The guy Gadan that was just taken out, the al-Shabaab leader in Somalia, that was taken out by the Obama administration and the military, the U.S. military, just a few days ago, was educated in a Pakistani madrasa, funded by Saudi Arabia and given a scholarship. Without Saudi Arabia funding that madrasa and giving that scholarship, he would not have been a threat to the United States or to the surrounding area of Africa where he was.
I do want to point out tonight, viewers had the opportunity to actually kind of discuss what they feel about it, to respond in real time to the president's speech using something called Microsoft's Bing Pulse technology. Tom Foreman has a quick look at what the response showed. Tom?
Yeah, overall, Anderson, people liked the speech. If you look at the overall reaction, it's all above the 50% line here. In gender lines, women in pink here a little bit better off than men over here. But in party, that's where you see the difference. And what you see is the Democrats in blue consistently always above the independents and the Republicans. And importantly, the independents tracked very well with the Republicans, not with the Democrats. This is the high point right over here. This point is where most people liked what he was saying, and at that point he was identifying the problem. Take a listen.
ISIL is a terrorist organization, pure and simple, and it has no vision other than the slaughter of all who stand in its way. In a region that has known so much bloodshed, these terrorists are unique in their brutality. They execute captured prisoners.
Point in all of this. Where did the people really dislike it the most? Independents and Republicans really not happy here.
Clearly, we just lost Tom Foreman. This is a smooth transition, eh?
Yeah, stuff happens. This television, this live television.
Here.
Anderson, good work. Thanks very much. Good evening to our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is a special edition of CNN Tonight. I'm Wolf Blitzer reporting from Washington. We're following the breaking news. The president lays out his strategy to defeat ISIS. No combat boots on the ground, but what he calls a relentless campaign, including airstrikes on targets, ISIS targets in Syria, not only in Iraq.
But I want the American people to understand how this effort will be different from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist using our air power and our support for partners' forces on the ground.
But has the commander-in-chief made his case to the American people and to the partner countries around the world who are vital to the plan's success? And will it work? We're here with CNN's team of experts. Let's begin with CNN's Jim Acosta. He's our senior White House correspondent. Jim.
Well, for the last several weeks, President Obama has been the cautioner-in-chief, cautious about his words, cautious about his actions, but that was not the case tonight. He is rolling the foreign policy dice, expanding U.S. military operations in both Iraq and Syria, ordering airstrikes, in fact, in Syria, although there's no timetable yet for those airstrikes. Take a listen to what the president had to say just about an hour ago.
Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven.
Now, up until tonight, the U.S. mission in Iraq going after ISIS has been basically to protect U.S. military personnel and to conduct humanitarian missions. That is no longer the case. On a senior administration official conference call with reporters earlier this evening, senior administration officials with the White House said that now the mission is to go after ISIS terrorists wherever they are, in Iraq or in Syria. Now, part of that involves ramping up the capabilities of Iraqi forces on the ground in Iraq. And so the president is ordering 475 U.S. military service members to go to Iraq to begin that mission. That brings the total there, Wolf, to 1,600 U.S. military personnel. But we were told on this background conference call with reporters that no U.S. military personnel will go into Syria to duplicate that mission there, although they do want to arm, train, equip those moderate opposition forces in Syria. They are not sending U.S. military personnel on the ground in Syria to conduct that part of the operation. One other thing that's important to point out, Wolf, on this conference call, the president's been talking about a global coalition. Saudi Arabia, very interestingly, will be a big part of that coalition. On that conference call earlier this evening, a senior administration official said Saudi Arabia will be hosting anti-ISIS fighter training. So that is where a lot of those Syrian rebels will be going for their training. They won't be trained by U.S. personnel on the ground in Syria. It sounds like they'll be trained in Saudi Arabia. Wolf.
Jim Acosta over at the White House. Thanks very much.